So this is my last talk, and as I said, you may already have been wondering about what my real views on some religious and spiritual matters are. I discussed in the first lecture the evolution of human spirituality, and I argued that the invention of the soul was a turning point in the history of our species. And then yesterday I talked a bit about nature worship and even about how that could actually have a positive effect on our health, at least and belief in God could do. So today I'm going to take a rather different line about the negative effects of religion, because I think it's very important in our contemporary world to realize the possible very difficult circumstances which are created by people's fundamentalist faiths. And I may say I'm not the first to have my own affirmation of spirituality mistaken for belief in religion. I quoted Rupert Brooke in the first lecture, a letter to a friend, and here's some more of that letter. He writes to his friend, the remedy for depression, his friend was very depressed, and that's why Brooke was writing to him, the remedy is mysticism or life. I'm not sure which. Don't leap or turn pale at the word mysticism. I do not mean any religious thing or any form of belief. I still burn and torture Christians daily. Well, I don't go quite that far, but I do think that while spirituality is life-enhancing, organized religion, whether it's Christianity or Judaism or Islam or whatever else there is out there, that can be deadening, and that's what I want to talk about today. This is the one lecture that I think Samuel Pufendorf might have appreciated, both because of his deep interest in human rights, but also because I gather he had no time for dogmatic theology. He was, of course, a Christian and was originally intended for the priesthood, like his father had been, but he, in fact, didn't join the priesthood because he actually found the dogmatism of the church all too much for him. So at least, though he wouldn't have agreed with all the sentiments, I think he'd have understood where I'm coming from. The lecture is it's based on a lecture I gave a few years ago for Amnesty International as an annual lecture in England, in Oxford. Although I've brought it up to date and I've illustrated it, the pictures weren't there to begin with. Some of the references are a few years old, but I think, unfortunately, not very much has changed. I mean, I wish I could say it had. Okay. Sticks and stones may break my bones, but words will never hurt me. That's how the English proverb goes. And since, like most proverbs, this one captures at least part of the truth, surely it makes sense that Amnesty International should have devoted most of its efforts to protecting people from the menace of sticks and stones, not of words. Worrying about words must have seemed something of a luxury. But still, this proverb, like most proverbs, is also in part obviously false. The fact is that words can hurt. For a start, they can hurt people indirectly by inciting others to hurt them. A crusade preached by a pope, for example, racist propaganda from the Nazis, malevolent gossip from a rival. And they can hurt people not so indirectly by inciting them to take actions that harm themselves. The lies of a false prophet, the blackmail of a bully, the flattery of a seducer. And words can hurt directly too. The lash of a malicious tongue, the dreaded message carried by a telegram, the spiteful onslaught that makes the hearer beg his tormentor to say no more. Sometimes, indeed, words can kill outright. There's a story by the philosopher Christopher Cherniak about a deadly word virus that appeared one night on a computer screen. It took the form of a brain teaser, a riddle so paradoxical that it fatally twisted the mind of anyone who heard or read it, making them fall into an irreversible coma. Well, that's a fiction, of course, but it's a fiction with some horrible parallels in the real world. There have been all too many examples, historically, of how words can take possession of a person's mind, destroying his will to live. Think, for example, of so-called voodoo death. The witch doctor has only to cast his spell of death upon a man, and within hours, the victim will collapse and die. Or, on a larger and more dreadful scale, think of the mass suicide at Jonestown in Guyana in 1972. The cult leader, Jim Jones, had only to plant certain crazed ideas in the heads of his disciples, and at his signal, 900 of them willingly drank cyanide. Words will never hurt me. The truth may rather be that words have a unique power to hurt. And if we were to make an inventory of the man-made causes of human misery, it would be words, not sticks and stones, that head the list. Even guns and high explosives might be considered playthings by comparison. Vladimir Mayakovsky wrote in his poem I, "On the pavement of my trampled soul, the souls of madmen stamped the print of rude, crude words." So should we then be fighting amnesty's battle on that front too? Should we be campaigning for the rights of human beings to be protected from verbal oppression and manipulation? Do we indeed need word laws, just as all civilized societies have gun laws, licensing who should be allowed to use them in what circumstances? Should there be Geneva protocols establishing what kinds of speech act count as crimes against humanity? No, I think the answer is obviously no. Don't even think of it. Freedom of speech is too precious a freedom to be meddled with. And however painful some of its consequences may sometimes be for some people, we should still, as a matter of principle, resist putting curbs on speech. By all means, we should try to make up for the harm that other people's words do, but not by censoring the words as such. And since I'm so sure of that in general, and since I'd expect most of you to be so too, I'll probably shock you when I say that it's the purpose of my lecture today to argue in one particular area just the opposite, to argue in short in favor of censorship, against freedom of expression, and to do so, moreover, in an area of life that has traditionally been regarded as sacrosanct. I'm talking about the moral and religious education of children, and especially the education a child receives at home, where parents are allowed, even expected, to determine for their children what counts as truth and falsehood, right and wrong. Children, I'll argue, have a human right not to have their minds crippled by exposure to other people's bad ideas, no matter who those other people are. And parents, correspondingly, have no God-given license to enculturate their children in whatever ways they personally choose, no right to limit the horizons of their children's knowledge, to bring them up in an atmosphere of dogma and superstition, or to insist they follow the straight and narrow paths of their own faith. In short, children have a right not to have their minds addled by nonsense, and we as a society have a duty to protect them from it. So we should no more allow parents to teach their children to believe, for example, in the literal truth of the Bible, or that the planets rule their lives, than we should allow parents to knock their children's teeth out or to lock them in a dungeon. Now that's the negative side of what I want to say, but there will be a positive side as well. If children have a right to be protected from false ideas, they also have a right to be succoured by the truth. And we as a society have a duty to provide it. Therefore, we should feel as much obliged to pass on to our children the best scientific and philosophical understanding of the natural world, to teach, for example, the truths of evolution and cosmology, or the methods of rational analysis. We should have as much an obligation to do that as we already feel obliged to feed and shelter children. Now, I don't suppose you'll doubt my good intentions here. Even so, I realize there must be some of you, especially the more liberal of you, that's probably all of you, who don't like the sound of this at all, neither the negative side of it, nor, perhaps still less, the positive side of it. In which case, among the good questions you might have for me will probably be these. First, what is all this about truths and lies? How could anyone these days have the face to argue that the modern scientific view of the world is the only true view that there is? Haven't the postmodernists and relativists taught us that more or less anything can be true in its own way? What possible justification could there be then for presuming to protect children from one set of ideas or to steer them towards another if, at the end of the day, all ideas are equally valid? And then second, even supposing that in some boring sense the scientific view really is more true than some others, who's to say that this truer worldview is actually a better one? At any rate, the better for everybody. Isn't it possible, or actually likely, that particular individuals, given who they are and what their life situation is, would be better served by one of the not-so-true worldviews. How could it possibly be right to insist on teaching children to think this modern way, when in practice the more traditional ways of thinking might actually work best for them? And then third, even in the unlikely event that almost everybody really would be happier and better off if they were brought up with the modern scientific picture, do we as a global community really want everyone right across the world thinking the same way, everyone living in a dreary scientific monoculture? Don't we want pluralism and cultural diversity, 100 flowers blooming, 100 schools of thought contending? And then last, why, when it comes to it, should children's rights be considered so much more important than those of other people? Everyone would grant, of course, that children are relatively innocent and relatively vulnerable, and so may have more need for protection than their seniors do. Still, why should the children's special rights in this respect take precedence over everybody else's rights in other respects? Don't parents have their own rights too? Their rights as parents, their right most obviously to be parents, or literally to bring forth and prepare their children for the future as they see fit. Well, I said those are good questions, and some of you may think they're knock-down questions, questions to which any broad-minded and progressive person could only give one answer. Now, I agree they are goodish questions and ones I should deal with, but I don't think it's by any means so obvious what the answers are, especially for a liberal. Indeed, were we to change the context not so greatly, most people's liberal instincts would, I'm sure, pull quite the other way. Let's suppose we are talking not about children's minds, but about children's bodies. Suppose the issue were not who should control a child's intellectual development, but who should control the development of her hands, or feet, or genitalia. Let's suppose, indeed, that this is a lecture about female circumcision, and the issue is not whether anyone should be permitted to deny a girl knowledge of Darwin, but whether anyone should be permitted to deny her the use of her clitoris. And now here I am suggesting that it's a girl's right to be left intact, that parents have no right to mutilate their daughters to suit their own socio-sexual agendas, and that we as a society ought to prevent it. What's more, what if I were to make the positive case as well, that every girl should actually be encouraged to find out how best to use, to her own advantage, the intact body she was born with? Well, would you still have those same good questions for me? And would it still be so obvious what the liberal answers are? There'll be a lesson, even if an awful one, in hearing how the questions sound. First, what is all this about intactness and mutilation? Haven't the anthropological relativists taught us that the idea of there being any such thing as absolute intactness is an illusion, and that girls are, in a way, just as intact without their clitorises? And anyway, even if uncircumcised girls are, in some boring sense, more intact, who's to say that intactness is a virtue? Isn't it possible that some girls, given their life situation, would actually be better off not being so intact? What if the men in their culture consider intact women unmarriageable? And besides, who wants to live in a world where all women have standard genitalia? Isn't it essential to maintaining the rich tapestry of human culture that there should be at least a few groups where circumcision is still practiced? Doesn't it indeed indirectly enrich the lives of all of us to know that some women somewhere have had their clitorises removed? In any case, why should it only be the rights of the girls that concern us? Don't other people have rights in relation to circumcision also? How about the rights of the circumcisers themselves, their rights as circumcisers? Or the rights of mothers to do what they think best, just as in their own day was done to them? Well, you'll agree, I hope, that the answers pull the other way now. I'm not going to leave that particular distressing picture up for you much longer. But maybe some of you are going to say that this is not playing fair. Whatever the superficial similarities between doing things to a child's body and doing things to her mind, there are also several obvious and important differences. For one thing, the effects of circumcision are final and irreversible, while the effects of even the most restrictive regime of education can perhaps be undone later. For another, Circumcision involves the removal of something that is already part of the body and will naturally be missed, while education involves selectively adding new things to the mind that would otherwise never have been there. To be deprived of the pleasures of bodily sensation is an insult at the most personal of levels, but to be deprived of a way of thinking is perhaps no great personal loss. And so you might argue that the analogy is too crude for us to learn from it, and those original questions about the rights to control a child's education still need addressing and answering on their own terms. And so very well, I will try and answer them on their own terms, and we'll see whether or not the analogy with circumcision is actually unfair. But there may be another kind of objection to my project that I should deal with first, for it might be argued, I suppose, that the whole issue of intellectual rights is not worth bothering about, since so few of the world's children are, in point of fact, at risk of being hurt by any severely misleading forms of education, and those that are mostly far away and out of reach. But now that I say that, however, I wonder whether anyone could make such a claim with a straight face. Look around you, close to home. We ourselves live in a society where most adults, and I don't just mean a few crazies, but most adults subscribe to a whole variety of weird and nonsensical beliefs that in one way or another they do shamelessly impose on their children. In the United States, for example, which I take to be the example in the United States, I take to the example since it claims to be the most modern and libertarian society in the world. There it sometimes seems that almost everyone is either a religious fundamentalist or a New Age mystic or both. And even those who aren't will scarcely dare admit it. Opinion polls confirmed, for example, that a full 98% of the US population say they believe in God. 70% believe in life after death. 50% believe in human psychic powers. 30% think their lives are directly influenced by the position of the stars, and 70% follow their horoscopes anyway, just in case. And 20% believe that they are at risk of being abducted by aliens. And the problem for children's education is not just that so many adults positively believe in things that flatly contradict the scientific worldview. It's that so many do not believe in things that are absolutely essential to the scientific view. A survey published a year or two ago showed that half the American people do not know, for example, that the Earth goes round the sun once a year. Fewer than 1 in 10 knows what a molecule is. More than half do not accept that human beings have evolved from animal ancestors, and less than 1 in 10 believe that evolution, if it's occurred, can have taken place without some kind of external intervention. And not only do people not know the results of science, they don't know what science is. When asked what they think distinguishes the scientific outlook, only 2% realized, 2% of the population realized it involves putting theories to the test. 34% vaguely knew it has something to do with experiments and measurement, but 66% didn't have a clue what science is about. Nor do those figures, worrying as they are, give the full picture of what children are up against. They tell us about the beliefs of typical people, and so about the belief environment of the average child. But there are small but significant communities just down the road from us, and I mean literally just down the road in New York or London, or I'm sure in Lund as well, where the situation is arguably very much worse. Communities where not only are superstition and ignorance even more firmly entrenched, but where this goes hand in hand with the imposition of repressive regimes of social and interpersonal conduct, in relation to hygiene or diet or dress or sex or gender roles, marriage arrangements, and so on. I think, for example, of the Amish Christians or the Hasidic Jews, the Jehovah's Witnesses, Orthodox Muslims, or for that matter, of the radical New Agers. All, no doubt, very different from each other, but all with their own peculiar hang-ups and neuroses, all alike in providing an intellectual and cultural dungeon for those who live among them. Now, in theory, of course, maybe the children need not suffer. Adults might perhaps keep their beliefs to themselves and not make any active attempt to pass them on. But we know, I'm sure, better than to expect that. This kind of self-restraint is simply not in the nature of a parent-child relationship. If a mother, for example, sincerely believes that homosexuality is an offense to God, then she will, of course, enlist her own children in the crusade. And look at who's the ages of the kids carrying the placards in an American street. But equally with more benign stupidities. If she believes that eating pork is a sin, or that the best cure for depression is holding a crystal to her head, or that after she dies she will be reincarnated as a mongoose, or that Capricorns and Aries are bound to quarrel, no doubt she'll want to pass on these very important lessons to her own offspring. And furthermore, restraint is not in the nature of successful belief systems. Belief systems in general flourish or die out according to how good they are at reproduction and competition. The better a system is at creating copies of itself, and the better at keeping other rival belief systems at bay, the greater its own chances of evolving and holding its own. So we should expect that it will be characteristic of successful belief systems, especially those that survive when everything else seems to be against them, that their devotees will be obsessed with education and discipline, insisting on the rightness of their own ways and rubbishing or preventing access to other ways. We should expect, moreover, that they will make a special point of targeting children in the home, while they're still available, impressionable, and vulnerable. For as the Jesuit master wisely noted, if I have the teaching of children up to 7 years of age, or thereabouts, I care not who has them afterwards. They are mine for life. The anthropologist Donald Crable, who made a close study of an Amish community in Pennsylvania, was well placed to observe just how this works out in practice. Groups threatened by extinction, he writes, must indoctrinate their offspring if they want to preserve their unique heritage. Socialization of the very young is one of the most potent forms of social control. As cultural values slip into the child's mind, they become personal values, embedded in conscience and governed by emotions. The Amish contend that the Bible commissions parents to train their children in religious matters as well as the Amish way of life. An ethnic nursery, staffed by extended family and church members, molds the Amish worldview in the child's mind from the first moments of consciousness. But what he's describing is not, of course, peculiar to the Amish. An ethnic nursery, staffed by extended family and church members, could be as much a description of the early environment of a Belfast Catholic, or of a Birmingham Sikh, or of a Brooklyn Hasidic Jew, or maybe, for that matter, in its own way, the child of a Cambridge lecturer. All sects that are serious about their own survival do indeed make every attempt to flood the child's mind with their own propaganda and to deny the child access to any alternative viewpoints. In the United States, this kind of restricted education has continually received the blessing of the law. Parents have the legal right, if they wish, to educate their children entirely at home, and nearly 1 million families still do so. In fact, it's increasing, and particularly in order that they shall not be exposed to non-religious ideas. Many more who wish to limit their children can rely on the thousands of sectarian schools that are permitted to function, subject to only minimal state supervision. The United States Court did recently insist that teachers at a Baptist school should at least hold teaching certificates. But at the same time, it recognized that, I'm quoting, the whole purpose of such a school is to foster the development of their children's minds in a religious environment, and therefore that the school should be allowed to teach all its subjects in its own way, quotes, which meant, as it happened, presenting all subjects only from the biblical point of view and requiring all teachers, supervisors, and assistants to agree with the church's doctrinal position. Yet parents hardly need the support of the law to achieve such a baleful hegemony over their children's minds. For there are, unfortunately, many ways of isolating children from external influences without actually physically removing or controlling what they hear in class. Dress a little boy in the uniform of the Hasidim, curl his side locks, subject him to strange dietary taboos, make him spend all weekend reading the Torah, tell him that Gentiles are dirty, and you could send him to any school in the world, and he'd still be a child of the Hasidim. And the same, just change the terms a bit, for a child of the Muslims or the Roman Catholics or the followers of the Maharishi Yogi. More worrying still, the children themselves may often be unwitting collaborators in this game of isolation. For children all too easily learn who they are, what is allowed for them, and where they must not go, even in thought. John Shoemaker, an Australian psychologist, has described his own Catholic boyhood. I believed wholeheartedly that I would burn in eternal fire if I ate meat on a Friday. I now hear that people no longer spend an eternity in fire for eating meat on Fridays. Yet I cannot help thinking back on the many Saturdays when I rushed to confess about the bologna and ketchup sandwich I could not resist the day before. I usually hoped I would not die before getting to the 3 p.m. confession. But all the same, this particular Catholic boy, John Shoemaker, he actually escaped and lived to tell the tale. And in fact, he's gone on to become an atheist and to make something of a profession of his godlessness. And nor, of course, is he unique. There are plenty of other examples we all know of men and women who, as children, were pressured into becoming junior members of a sect, Christian, Jewish, Muslim, Marxist, and yet who came out the other side, free thinkers and seemingly none the worse for their experience. Then perhaps I am, after all, being too alarmist about what all this means. For sure, the risks are real enough. We do live, even in our advanced democratic Western nations, in an environment of spiritual oppression, where many little children, our neighbours' children, if not actually ours, are daily exposed to the attempts of adults to annex their minds. Yet you may still want to point out that there's a big difference between what the adults want and what actually goes on. All right, so children do frequently get saddled with adult nonsense. But so what? Maybe it's just something the child has to put up with until he or she is able to leave home and to learn better. In which case, I'd have to admit that the issue is certainly nothing like so serious as I've been making out. After all, there are surely lots of things that are done to children, either accidentally or by design, that, though they may not be ideal for the child at the time, have no lasting ill effects. Well, I'd reply yes and no. Yes, it's right we should not fall into the error of a previous generation of psychology of assuming that people's values and beliefs are determined once and for all by what they learn or do not learn as children. In fact, the first years of life, though certainly formative, are not necessarily the critical period they were once thought to be. Psychologists no longer generally believe that children imprint on the first ideas they come across and thereafter refuse to follow any others. In most cases, rather, it seems that individuals can and will remain open to new opportunities of learning later in life, and if need be, will be able to make up a surprising amount of lost ground in areas where they've earlier been deprived or been misled. So yes, I agree, therefore, we shouldn't be too alarmist or too prissy about the effects of early learning. But then no, we should certainly not be too sanguine about it either. True, it may not be so difficult for a person to unlearn or replace factual knowledge later in life. Someone who once thought the world was flat, for example, may, when faced by overwhelming evidence to the contrary, grudgingly come round to accept that the world is actually round. It will, however, often be very much more difficult for a person to unlearn established procedures or habits of thought. Someone who's grown used, for example, to taking everything on trust from biblical authority may find it very hard, indeed, to adopt a more critical and questioning attitude. And it may be nigh impossible for a person to unlearn attitudes and emotional reactions. Someone who's learned as a child, for example, to think of sex as sinful may never again be able to be relaxed about making love. And Paul Ekman, in his lecture a couple of days ago, was also making just that point about some of these things really do stick, especially the emotional ones. But there's another reason more pressing than this for not being too sanguine or sanguine in the least. Research has shown that given the opportunity, individuals can go on learning and recover from poor childhood environments. However, what we should be worrying about are precisely those cases where such opportunities do not, indeed are not allowed to occur. Suppose, as I began to describe above, children are in effect locked out by their families from access to any alternative ideas. or worse, that they're so effectively immunized against foreign influences that they do the locking out themselves. Think of those cases, not so uncommon, where it's become a central plank of someone's belief system, that they must not let themselves be defiled by mixing with others, when, because of their faith, all they want to hear is one voice, and all they want to read is one text. When they treat new ideas as if they carry infection. When later, as they grow more sophisticated, they come to deride reason as an instrument of Satan. When they regard the humility of unquestioning obedience as a virtue. When they identify ignorance of worldly affairs with spiritual grace. In such cases, it hardly matters that their minds may still remain capable of learning, because they themselves will have made certain that they never again use this capacity. The question was, does childhood indoctrination matter? And the answer, I regret to say, is yes, it matters even more than you might guess. The Jesuit did know what he was saying. Though human beings are remarkably resilient, the truth is that the effects of well-designed indoctrination may still prove irreversible, because one of the effects of such indoctrination will be precisely to remove the means and the motivation to reverse it. Several of these belief systems couldn't survive in a free and open market of comparison and criticism, but they've cunningly seen to it that they don't have to, by enlisting believers as their own jailers. There was a program 2 weeks ago on BBC television. Here's a quotation from one of the Hasidic Jews talking proudly about his community in North London. The Hasidim see modern technology as a potential danger, putting at risk the holiness of the community and threatening the innocent minds of its children. Television is known as the Yetzer Hara box, which roughly translated means the evil temptation machine. Owning one can be likened to having an open sewer in the lounge. Now that's in 2011 in North London. Still, we can ask, what would happen if this kind of vicious circle of self-imprisonment were, in fact, to be forcibly broken? What would happen if, for example, there were to be an externally imposed time out? Wouldn't we predict that just to the extent that it is a vicious circle, the process of becoming a fully fledged believer might, in fact, be surprisingly easy to disrupt? I think the clearest evidence of how these belief systems typically hold sway over their followers can in fact be found in historical examples of what's happened when group members have been involuntarily exposed to the fresh air of the outside world. An interesting example, an interesting test of this was provided in the 1960s by the case of the Amish and the military draft. The Amish have consistently refused to serve in the armed forces of the United States on grounds of conscience. Up to the 1960s, young Amish men who were due to be drafted for military service were regularly granted agricultural deferments and were able to continue working safely on their family farms. But as the draft continued throughout the Vietnam War, an increasing number of these men were deemed ineligible for farm deferments and were required instead to serve 2 years working in public hospitals, where they were introduced, like it or not, to all manner of non-Amish people and non-Amish ways. Now, when the time came for these men to return home, many of them no longer wanted to do so and opted to defect. They'd tasted the sweets of a more open, adventurous, free-thinking way of life, and they were not about to declare it all a snare and a delusion. Now, these defections were rightly regarded by the Amish leaders as such a serious threat to their culture's survival that they quickly moved to negotiate a special agreement with the government under which all their draftees could in future be sent to Amish-run farms, so that this kind of breach of security should not happen again. So let me take stock. I've been discussing the survival strategies of some of the more tenacious belief systems, the epidemiology, if you like, of those religious and pseudo-religious ideas that Richard Dawkins has called cultural viruses. But you'll see that, especially with this last example, I've begun to approach the next and more important of the issues I want to address today, the ethical one. Suppose that, as the Amish case suggests, young members of such a faith would, if given the opportunity to make up their own minds, choose to leave. Doesn't this say something important about the morality of imposing any such faith on children to begin with? Well, I think it does, and in fact I think it says everything we need to know in order to condemn it. Suppose again it were female circumcision we were talking about. We could surely build a moral case against it based just on considering whether it was something a woman would choose for herself. Given the fact, and I assume it is a fact, that most of those women who are circumcised as children would, if they only knew what they were missing, have preferred to remain intact. Given that almost no woman who is not circumcised as a child volunteers to undergo the operation later in life, given in short that it seems not to be what free women want to have done to their bodies, then it seems clear that whoever takes advantage of their temporary power over a child's body to perform the operation must be abusing their power and acting wrongly. Well, then, if that's so for bodies, then I think the same for minds. Given, let's say, that most people who've been brought up as members of a sect would, if they only knew what they were being denied, have preferred to remain outside it. Given that almost no one who was brought up this way volunteers to adopt the faith later in life, given in short that it's not a faith that a free thinker would adopt, then likewise it seems clear that whoever takes advantage of their temporary power over a child's mind to impose this faith is equally abusing this power and acting wrongly. So I'll come to the main point and lesson of my lecture. I want to propose a general test for deciding when and whether the teaching of a belief system is morally defensible. And it's as follows. If it's ever the case that teaching a belief system to children if it's ever the case that teaching this system to children will mean that later in life they come to hold beliefs that, were they in fact to have had access to alternatives, they would most likely not have chosen for themselves, then it's morally wrong of whoever presumes to impose this system and to choose for them to do so. No one has the right to choose badly for anyone else. Now, this test, I admit, will not be simple to apply. It's rare enough for there to be the kind of social experiment that occurred with the Amish and the military draft. And even such an experiment doesn't actually provide so strong a test as I'm suggesting we require. After all, the Amish young men were not offered the alternative until they were already almost grown up. Whereas what we need to know is what the children of the Amish or any other sect would choose for themselves if they were to have had access to the full range of alternatives all along. But in practice, of course, such a totally free choice is never going to be available. But still, utopian as the criterion is, I think its moral implications remain pretty obvious. For even supposing we cannot know and can only guess on the basis of weaker tests whether an individual exercising this genuinely free choice would himself choose the beliefs that others intend to impose upon him, then this state of ignorance is in itself grounds for making it morally wrong for anyone else to proceed to impose beliefs on him. Now, I suspect most of you will probably be happy to go along with this, so far as it goes. Of course, other things being equal, everybody has a right to self-determination of both body and mind, and it must indeed be morally wrong of others to stand in the way of it. But that is other things being equal. And to continue with those questions I raised earlier, what happens when other things are not equal? It's surely a commonplace in ethics that sometimes the rights of individuals have to be limited or even overruled in the interests of the larger good, or to protect the rights of other people. And it's certainly not immediately obvious why the case of children's intellectual rights should be an exception. As we saw, there are several factors that might be considered counterbalancing. And of these, the one that seems to most people, or to many people, the weightiest one, or at least is often mentioned first, is our interest in maintaining cultural diversity. All right, you may want to say, so it's tough on a child of the Amish or the Hasidim or the Gypsies to be shaped up by their parents in the way that they have been. But at least the result is that these fascinating cultural traditions continue. Wouldn't our whole civilization be impoverished if they were to go? It's a shame maybe when individuals have to be sacrificed to maintain such diversity, but there it is. It's the price we pay as a society. Except I feel bound to remind you, it's not the price we pay, it's the price they pay. Let me give a telling example. In 1995, in the high mountains of Peru, some climbers came across the frozen, mummified body of a young Inca girl. She was dressed as a princess. She was 13 years old. About 500 years ago, this little girl had, it seems, been taken alive up the mountain by a party of priests and then ritually killed, a sacrifice to the mountain's gods in the hope that they would look kindly on the people below. The discovery was described by the anthropologist Johann Reinhard in an article for the National Geographic magazine. And he was clearly elated, both as a scientist and as a human being, by the romance of finding what he called this ice maiden. Even so, he did express some reservations about how she'd come to be there. We can't help but shudder, he wrote, at the Incas' practice of performing human sacrifice. Well, this discovery was also made the subject of a documentary film shown on American television. Some of you may even have seen the National Geographic film. But in the film, however, no one expressed any reservations whatever. Instead, viewers were simply invited to marvel at the spiritual commitment of the Inca priests and to share with the girl on her last journey her pride and excitement at having been selected for the signal honor of being sacrificed. The message of the TV program was, in effect, that the practice of human sacrifice was, in its own way, a glorious cultural invention, another jewel in the crown of multiculturalism, if you like. But how dare anyone suggest this? How dare they invite us, in our sitting rooms, watching television, to feel uplifted by contemplating an act of ritual murder, the murder of a dependent child by a group of stupid, puffed up, superstitious, ignorant old men? How dare they invite us to find good for ourselves in contemplating an immoral act against someone else? Well, immoral? Immoral, do I mean by Inca standards? No, that's not what matters. I mean immoral by our standards, and in particular by the standard of free choice that I was enunciating earlier. The plain fact is that none of us, knowing what we do now about how the world works, would freely choose to be sacrificed as she was. And however proud the Inca girl may or may not have been to have had the choice made for her by her family, and for all we know, she may actually have felt betrayed and terrified, we can still be pretty sure that she, if she'd known what we do know now, would not have chosen this fate for herself. No, this girl was being used by others as a means for achieving their ends. The elders of her community valued their collective security above her life, and decided for her that she must die in order that their crops might grow and that they might live. Now, 500 years later, we ourselves must not in a lesser way do the same, by thinking of her death as something that enriches our collective culture. We mustn't do that here, and nor in any of the other cases where we're invited to celebrate other people's subjection to quaint and backward traditions as evidence of what a rich world we live in. We mustn't do it even when it can be argued, as I would agree it sometimes can be, that the maintenance of these minority traditions is potentially a benefit to all of us, because they keep alive ways of thinking that might one day serve as a valuable counterpoint to the majority culture. The United States Supreme Court, in supporting the Amish claim to be exempt from sending their children to public schools, commented in an aside, "We must not forget that in the Middle Ages, important values of the civilization of the Western world were preserved by members of religious orders who isolated themselves from all worldly influences against great obstacles." And by analogy, the court implied we should recognize that the Amish may be preserving ideas and values that our own descendants may one day wish to return to. But what the courts failed to recognize is that there's a crucial difference between the religious communities of the Middle Ages, the monks of Holy Island, for example, and the present-day Amish. Namely, that the monks made their own choice to become monks. They didn't have monasticism imposed on them as children, nor did they in turn impose it on their children, for indeed they didn't have any. These medieval orders survived by the recruitment of adult volunteers. The Amish, by contrast, survive only by kidnapping little children before they can protest. The Amish may possibly have wonderful things to teach the rest of the world, and so may possibly the Incas have done, and so may several other outlying groups. But these things must not be paid for by the children's lives. That's surely the crux of it. It's a cornerstone of every decent moral system, stated explicitly by Immanuel Kant, but already implicit in most people's very idea of morality, that human individuals have an absolute right to be treated as ends in themselves, and never as means to achieving other people's ends. It goes without saying that this right applies no less to children than to anybody else. And since in so many situations children are in no position to look after themselves, it's morally obvious that the rest of us have a particular duty to watch out for them. And so, in every case where we come across examples of children's lives being manipulated to serve other ends, I think we do have a duty to protest. And this no matter whether the other ends involve the mollification of the gods, or the preservation of important values for Western civilization, or the creation of an interesting anthropological exhibit for the rest of us, or, and I'll come to the next big question that's been waiting, even if it's being done in order to fulfill certain needs and aspirations of the child's own parents. There is, I'd say, no reason whatever why we should treat the actions of parents as coming under a different set of moral rules here. The relationship of parent to child is, of course, a special one in all sorts of ways, but it's not so special as to deny the child her individual personhood. It's not a relationship of extension, nor one of ownership. Children are not a part of their parents, nor except figuratively do they belong to them. Children are in no sense their parents' private property, and indeed, to quote the US Supreme Court commenting in a different context on this same issue, it's, quotes, a moral fact that a person belongs to himself and not others, nor to society as a whole. So it will therefore be as much a breach of a child's right if he or she is used by their parents to achieve the parents' personal goals as it would be if this were being done by anyone else. No one has a right to treat children as anything less than ends in themselves. But still, some of you, I'm sure, will want to argue that the case of parents is not quite the same as that of outsiders. And no doubt we'd all agree that parents have, no doubt we would all agree that parents have no more right than anyone else to exploit children for ends that are obviously selfish, to abuse them sexually, for example, or to exploit them as servants, or to sell them into slavery. But first, isn't it different when the parents at least think their own ends are the child's ends too? When their manipulation of the child's beliefs to conform to theirs is, so far as they're concerned, entirely in the child's best interests? And then second, isn't it different when the parents have already invested so much of their own resources in the child, giving him or her so much of their love and care and time? Haven't they somehow earned the reward of having their child honor their beliefs, even if these beliefs are, by other people's lights, eccentric or old-fashioned? Don't these considerations together mean that parents do at least have some rights that other people don't, and rights which arguably should come before, or at least rank beside, the rights of the children themselves? Well, I'd say no. The truth is these considerations simply don't add up to any form of rights, let alone rights that could outweigh the children's rights. At most, they simply provide mitigating circumstances. Imagine, suppose you were misguidedly to give your own child poison. The fact that you might think the poison you were administering was good for your child, the fact that you might have gone to a lot of trouble to obtain this poison, and that if it were not for all your efforts, your child wouldn't even be there to be offered it. None of this would give you a right to administer the poison. At most, it would only make you less culpable when the child died. But in any case, to see parents as simply misguided about the child's true interests is, I think, to put too generous a construction on it. For it's not at all clear that parents, when they take control of their children's spiritual and intellectual lives really do believe that they're acting in the child's best interests rather than their own. Abraham, when he was commanded by God on the mountain to kill his son Isaac and dutifully went ahead with the preparation, was surely not thinking of what was best for Isaac. He was thinking of his own relationship with God. And so on down the ages. Parents have used and still use their children to bring themselves spiritual or social benefits, dressing them up, educating them, baptizing them, bringing them to confirmation or bar mitzvah in order to maintain their own social and religious standing. Consider again the analogy with circumcision. No one should make the mistake of supposing that female circumcision in those places where it's practiced is done to benefit the girl. Rather, it's done for the honor of the family, to demonstrate the parents' commitment to a tradition, to save them from dishonor. And it's much the same, I'd say, in many of the other cases I've been discussing. A Christian fundamentalist mother, for example, forbids her child from attending classes on evolution. Well, though she may claim she's doing it for the child, and not, of course, herself, she's very likely motivated primarily by a desire to make a display of her own purity. Doesn't she just know that God is mighty proud of her for conforming to his will? The chief mullah of Saudi Arabia proclaims that the earth is flat and that anyone who teaches otherwise is a friend of Satan. Or won't the mullah be himself thrice blessed by Allah for making this courageous stand? A group of rabbis in Jerusalem try to ban the showing of the film Jurassic Park on the grounds that it may give children the idea that there were dinosaurs living on Earth 60 million years ago, when the scriptures, of course, state that, in fact, the world is just 6,000 years old. Well, aren't those rabbis making a wonderful public demonstration of their piety? What we're seeing as often as not is pure self-interest, in which case we shouldn't even allow a mitigating plea of good intentions on the part of the parent or the other responsible adult. They're looking after no one other than themselves. Yet, as I said, in the end, it hardly matters what the parents' intentions are, because even the best intentions would not be sufficient to buy them parental rights over their children. Indeed, the very idea that parents or any other adults have rights over children is morally insupportable. No human being in any other circumstances is credited with having rights over anyone else. No one is entitled, as of right, to control, use, or direct the life course of another person, even for objectively good ends. It's true that in the past, slave owners had such legal rights over their slaves. And it's true that until comparatively recently, the anomaly persisted of husbands having certain such rights over their wives, the right to have sex with them, for example. But neither of these exceptions, I think, provides a good model for regulating parent-child relationships. Children, to repeat, have to be considered as having interests independent of their parents. They cannot be subsumed as if they were part of the same person. At least, so it should be. Unless, that is, we make the extraordinary mistake that the US Supreme Court apparently did when it ruled in relation to the Amish, that while the Amish way of life may be considered good or even erratic, it interferes with no rights or interests of others, as if the children of the Amish are not even to be counted as potentially others. I think we should stop talking of parental rights at all. Insofar as they compromise the child's rights as an individual, parents' rights have no status in ethics and should have none in law. That's not to say that, other things being equal, parents shouldn't be treated by the rest of us with due respect and accorded certain privileges in relation to their children. Privileges, however, do not have the same legal or moral status significance as rights. Privileges are by no means unconditional. They come as the quid pro quo for agreeing to abide by certain rules of conduct imposed by society at large. And anyone to whom a privilege is granted remains in effect on probation. A privilege granted can be taken away. Let's suppose that the privilege of parenting will mean, for example, that provided parents agree to act within an agreed framework, they shall indeed be allowed, without interference from the law, to do all the things that parents everywhere usually do. Feeding, clothing, educating, disciplining their children, and enjoying the love and creative involvement that follow from it. but it will explicitly not be part of this deal that parents should be allowed to offend against the children's more fundamental rights to self-determination. If parents abuse their privileges in this regard, the contract lapses, and it's then the duty of those who have granted the privilege to intervene. Well, intervene how? Suppose we as a society, don't like what's happening when the education of a child has been left to the parents or the priests. Suppose we fear for the child's mind and want to take remedial action. Suppose indeed we want to take preemptive action with all children to protect them from being hurt by bad ideas and to give them the best possible start as thoughtful human beings. Well, what should we be doing about it? What should be our birthday present to them from the grown-up world? My suggestion at the start of this talk was science, universal scientific education. That's to say, education in learning from observation, experiment, hypothesis testing, constructive doubt, critical thinking, and in the truths that flow from that. And so I come at last to what's the most provocative of the questions that I asked at the start. What's so special about science? Why these truths? Why should it be morally right to teach this to everybody when it's apparently so morally wrong to teach all those other things? Well, you don't have to be one of those out-and-out relativists to ask such questions and to be suspicious that any attempt to replace the old truths by newer scientific truths might be nothing more than an attempt to replace one dogmatism by another. The Supreme Court, in its judgment about Amish schooling, was careful to warn that we should never rule out one way of thinking and rule another in, merely on the basis of what happens to be the modern fashionable opinion. There can be no assumption, the court said, that today's majority is right and the Amish and others are wrong. The Amish way of life is not to be condemned because it's different. Well, maybe so, and yet I'd say the court has chosen to focus on the wrong issue here. Even if science were the majority worldview, which, as we saw earlier, is hardly the case, we'd all agree that this in itself would provide no grounds for promoting science over other systems of thought. The majority is clearly not right about lots of things, and probably about most things. But the grounds I'm proposing are much firmer. I think science stands apart and superior to all the other systems, because it alone, of all the systems in contention, meets the criterion I laid out above, namely that it represents a set of beliefs that any reasonable person would, if given the chance, choose for himself. Now, I should say that again, I think, and put it in context. I argued earlier that the only circumstances under which it should be morally acceptable to impose a particular way of thinking on children is when the result will be that later in life they come to hold beliefs that they would have chosen anyway, no matter what alternative beliefs they were exposed to. And what I'm now saying is that science is the one way of thinking, maybe the only one, that passes this test. There's a fundamental asymmetry between science and everything else. What do you reckon? Let's go to the rescue of that Inca girl who's being told by the priests that unless she dies on the mountain, the gods will rain down lava on her village. And let's offer her another way of looking at things. Offer will rain down lava on her village. And let's offer her another way of looking at things. Offer her a choice as to how she'll grow up. On one side with the story about divine anger, on the other with the insights from geology as to how volcanoes arise from the movement of tectonic plates. Well, which story will she choose? Let's go help the Muslim boy who's being schooled by the mullahs into believing that the earth is flat. And let's explore some of the ideas of scientific geography with him. Better still, let's take him high up in a balloon, show him the horizon, and invite him to use his own senses and powers of reasoning to reach his own conclusions. Now offer him the choice, the picture presented in the book of the Quran or the one that flows from his newfound scientific understanding. Which will he prefer? Well, let's take picture on that Baptist teacher who's become wedded to creationism. And let's give her a vacation. Let's walk around the Natural History Museum in the company of Richard Dawkins or Daniel Dennett, or perhaps if they're too scary, David Attenborough. and let's have them explain the possibilities of evolution to her. Now offer her the choice: the story of Genesis with all its paradoxes and special pleading, or the startlingly simple idea of natural selection. Which will she choose? My questions are rhetorical because the answers are already in. We know very well which way people will go when they really are allowed to make up their own minds on questions such as these. Conversions from superstition to science have been and are everyday events. They've probably been part of all of our personal experience. Those of us who have been walking in darkness have seen a great light, the aha of scientific revelation. By contrast, conversions from science back to superstition are virtually unknown. It just doesn't happen that someone who's learnt and understood science and its methods, and who's then offered a non-scientific alternative, chooses to abandon science. I doubt there's ever been a case, for example, of someone who's been brought up to believe in the geological theory of volcanoes moving over to believing in divine anger instead, or of someone who's seen and appreciated that the evidence that the world is round, reverting to the idea that the world is flat, or even of someone who has once understood the power of Darwinian theory, going back to preferring the story of Genesis. People do, of course, sometimes abandon their existing scientific beliefs in favor of new and better scientific alternatives. But to choose one scientific theory over another is still to remain absolutely true to science. The reason for this asymmetry between science and non-science isn't, at least it's not only that science provides so much better, so much more economical, elegant, beautiful explanations than non-science, although there is that. The still stronger reason I'd suggest is that science is by its very nature a participatory process, and non-science is not. In learning science, we learn why we should believe this or that. Science doesn't cajole, it doesn't dictate. It lays out the factual and theoretical arguments as to why something is so, and invites us to assent to them, to see it for ourselves. Hence, by the time someone has understood a scientific explanation, they have, in a sense, an important sense, already chosen it as theirs. How different is the case of religious or superstitious explanation? Religions make no pretense of engaging their devotees in any process of rational discovery or choice. If we dare ask why we should believe something, the answer will be because it's been written in the book, because this is our tradition, because it was good enough for Moses, because you'll go to heaven that way, or, as often as not, just don't ask. Contrast these two positions. On the one side, the 2nd century Roman theologian Tertullian, with his abject submission to authority and denial of our personal involvement in choosing our beliefs. For us, he wrote, curiosity is no longer necessary after Jesus Christ, nor inquiry after the gospel. This being the same man, I might remind you, who said of Christianity, it's certain because it is impossible. On the other side, contrast the 12th century English philosopher Adelard of Bath, one of the earliest interpreters of Arab science, with his injunction that we all make ourselves personally responsible for understanding what goes on around us. If anyone living in a house, he writes, is ignorant of what it's made, he's unworthy of its shelter. And if anyone born in the residence of this world neglects learning the plan underlying its marvelous beauty, he is unworthy and deserves to be cast out of it. So imagine that the choice is yours. Think that you've been faced in the formative years of your life with a choice between these two paths to enlightenment, between basing your beliefs on the ideas of others imported from another country and another time, and basing them on ideas that you have been able to see growing in your home soil. Can there be any doubt that you'll choose which you'll choose for yourself, that you will choose science? And because people will so choose if they have the opportunities of scientific education, I say that as a society, we're entitled with good conscience to insist on their being given that opportunity. That is, we are entitled to choose this way of thinking for them. Indeed, we're not just entitled. In the case of children, we are morally obliged to do so as to protect them from being early victims of other ways of thinking that would remove them from the field. And so let me catch the question, which I might get, probably not in this audience, but in other places I've talked this way. How would you like it if some big brother were to insist on your children being taught his beliefs? How would you like it if I tried to impose my personal ideology on your little girl? Well, I do have the answer, that teaching science isn't like that. It's not about teaching someone else's beliefs. It's about encouraging the child to exercise her own powers of understanding, to arrive at her own beliefs. For sure, this is likely to mean that my daughter will end up with beliefs that are widely shared with others who've taken the same path. Beliefs, that is, in what science reveals as the truth about the world. And yes, if you want to put it this way, you could say this means that by her own efforts at understanding, she will become a scientific conformist, one of those predictable people who believes that matter is made of atoms, that the universe arose with the Big Bang, that humans are descended from monkeys, that consciousness is a function of the brain, that there's no life after death, and so on. But since someone asks, I'll say I'd be only too pleased if a big brother or big sister or a school teacher or anyone else in this room should help her get to that enlightened state. The habit of questioning, the ability to tell good answers from bad, an appetite for seeing how and why deep explanations work. Such is what I would want for my daughter, because I think it's what she, given the chance, would one day want for herself. But it's also what I'd want for her, because I'm too well aware of what might otherwise befall her. Bad ideas continue to swill through our culture, some old, some new, looking for receptive minds to capture. If this girl, because she was to lack the defences of critical reasoning, were ever to fall to some kind of political or spiritual irrationalism, then I and you and our society would have failed her. Words, children are made of the words they hear. It matters what we tell them. They can be hurt by words. They may go on to hurt themselves still further and in turn become the kind of people that hurt others. But they can be given life by words as well. I've set before you life and death, blessing and cursing. These are the words of Deuteronomy. Therefore, choose life, that both thou and thy seed may live. And I think there should be no limit to our duty to help children to choose life.